Thank you. Just a couple corrections to the biography. My books have been translated, I think, to almost close to 20 languages now. And the book on bullying will not be published this year because I haven't written it yet. I'm too busy traveling, and so it'll be published next year, and the title will be The Bully Syndrome, the making and unmaking of bullies. Now, bullying is actually a good place to start this conversation with, because almost every school board, in fact every school board in North America, has instituted anti-bullying programs, and bullying is a huge issue throughout North America now. I mean, you all heard of the case 3 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago now, where this girl in the United States, a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old, hung herself with her sister's scarf because she was bullied so viciously in school. And then there was another school shooting in the States a week later or 2 weeks later, where again the kid had been bullied and he finally snapped and he killed somebody. And the FBI, when they did a survey of school shooters, a majority of them had been bullied kids. And the response to bullying from the school boards and the educational authorities and the psychological experts and the behavior experts and the parenting experts is that bullying is a learned behavior problem, and so therefore we have to discourage it by teaching kids not to bully, and we have to discourage it by punishing the bully. Hence we have the zero tolerance programs. The problem is they don't work. If you look at the research on the bullying programs, they don't work. The best of them, according to the research, have a 25% success rate. So they can reduce bullying by 25%. These are the best programs. The majority work zero. Now why is that? If something is not working, perhaps we should have to consider that the way we're approaching it is wrong. In other words, that the way we understand and how we approach a problem depends very much on how we perceive it. Now this is not a talk on bullying, but it is a talk on what's happening to kids today. It is a talk on why so many kids are having difficulties regulating themselves, learning, why the general sense that parents have that kids don't respect them, that they have difficulty, the parents, have difficulty passing their values on to one another. It's as if our kids will listen to some music that we don't hear, and they're being seduced by that siren song that we're not aware of where it's coming from. And the question I'm looking at is why, what's going on? Now, the usual approach in North America is a behavior one. So if the behavior is bad, then we try to stop the behavior by either punishing the bad behavior. This approach is a behavioral one. So, for example, a kid acts out, then we punish him. That's the usual approach. If they act out, we punish him. We punish him with timeouts, or with tough love, or logical consequences, or something. I want you to consider something. I'm going to ask you this question. When you hear me use the phrase act out, what do you see in your mind's eye? For most of you, if you're trained in this culture, when I say that a kid is acting out, you'll see that kid being rude. If you think of the phrase acting out, it doesn't mean bad behavior. It has a very specific meaning. When you act out, you're portraying in behavior something you haven't got the language to say in words. So in a game of charades, you have to act out because you're not permitted to use words. If you landed in a country where nobody spoke your language and you had to portray or convey that you're hungry or tired, you have to act it out so that people would understand you. Well, I want you to consider the possibility that our children's behavior, their so-called oppositionality, their rudeness, their difficulty learning from negative experience, their bullying, their precocious sexuality, all the stuff that they do isn't acting out. In other words, they're portraying something in behavior they haven't got the language for. So our job is to understand what is being acted out and to respond to the message. Not to try and suppress the message, but to respond to it creatively. And that's really the essence of my talk. But the behavioral approach doesn't let you do that. The behavioral approach just says, stop this behavior by any way you can. So you reward the good behavior or you punish the bad. That's it. Now the other thing that's happened in North America is that childhood has been heavily medicalized. So now we're diagnosing kids with all kinds of problems. So there are millions of children getting stimulant medications for ADHD, and hundreds of thousands of children getting antipsychotic medications, such as risperidol or Seroquel, medications, that is to say, that we give to adult schizophrenics to control their psychoses. Oh my God, thank you. Medications that we give to adult psychotics to control their hallucinations and their paranoia, and we're giving this to kids to control their behaviors. In other words, and we're diagnosing all these kids with Asperger's and autism spectrum disorders and ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, and we're medicating them. We've made a medical problem out of it. Now I'm going to tell you right now that not only is there no such thing as oppositional defiant disorder, not even in theory can there be such a thing. And why that is the case I will show you later. But that's the approach. We medicalize kids. At least the medical approach is a step forward, only in the sense that if we diagnose a kid with a disorder, at least we're not blaming him. At least we're not blaming him for the behavior. We're not punishing him for the behavior. We're trying to somehow help him. But it's a very restricted and limited kind of help. Now, the only way to understand people really is not through the lens of medical diagnosis, nor through the lens of behavior control, but through what has been called a biopsychosocial approach. And that means that we understand that human beings, especially children, develop in a context. Now let me read you from a Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, who talks about that very issue in one of his books. When we see a child who's well behaved, we may understand the source and reason for his good behavior is the ground that nurtured him, his community and his family. It is even more important to see the interdependently co-arising nature. By interdependently co-arising, he means that everything arises in connection with everything else, and a child is a manifestation of his or her environment, not an independent, isolated entity. It is even more important to see the interdependently co-arising nature of a child who's cruel. Just as with good behavior, the reasons for a child cruelty can be found in his family, society, school, friends, and ancestors. If we do not shine the light of interdependent co-arising on the child's character, we don't see how these problems relate to his life and his environment and his relationships. We get angry or afraid and we blame him. We must do our best to understand his interdependent self-nature in order to understand him, accept him, love him, and help him transform. So the real issue is to understand the circumstances that give a rise to children's behaviors, not just to respond to the behaviors themselves. Now let me give you this principle of the interdependent co-arising of phenomena applies not just to child behavior, it applies to human life from the beginning to the end of life. And I'll give you 3 examples of that, just by way of introduction. A couple of years ago, there was a study that showed that children whose mothers are stressed or depressed are more likely to have asthma than other kids. So the mother's stress or depression can trigger asthma in the child. Now the researchers, being medical doctors, had no way to understand that finding. What does the mother's stress or depression have to do with the kid's lungs? Well, they were confused only because they hadn't read my book, When the Body Says No, where I talked about this stuff 7 or 8 years ago, because it's not new information. It's just that the information comes out and it's not incorporated into the medical perspective on things. Now, why a child whose mother is stressed or depressed is more likely to have asthma is very straightforward scientifically. Very straightforward. Has anybody here ever been treated for asthma? You have? Okay. A couple of you. What medications were you given? Ventolin and Flovent. Okay, so you received 2 inhalers. One of them is called Ventolin. What happens in asthma is you get narrowing of the airways. The muscles that surround the breathing tubes go into spasm. And so the Ventolin is called a bronchodilator because it dilates up the air tubes by relaxing those muscles. So now the air can flow more freely through a larger caliber tube. The other aspect of asthma is inflammation. You get swelling and inflammatory debris cluttering up the airway. So the Flovent inhaler is designed to suppress the inflammation. Now the Ventolin is a copy of adrenaline. It's a direct copy of adrenaline. And the Flovent is a steroid, a direct copy of cortisol. Okay? Now, some of you are beginning to follow this. Does anybody know what cortisol and adrenaline are? They're stress hormones. They're the body's own stress hormones made by our own adrenal gland. In other words, we're treating the asthmatic with stress hormones. Why? Because their stress mechanisms have been overwhelmed, and now we have to give them extra hormones to keep their airways open. And why the airways of a child who's under stress or depressed, the emotional states of the parents do so much to program the physiology of children. The number of childhood visits for mental health disorders in Windsor, Ontario went up 50% in the year 2009. Any idea why that should happen in Windsor, Ontario? It's an auto-making town, heavily hit by the economic crisis. When the parents are stressed, the children get stressed, and now the kids are diagnosed and medicated. So that's in childhood. I'm not blaming mothers here, by the way, for being stressed or depressed. Nobody chooses to be stressed or depressed. I'm just saying that when you are, your kids suffer. The reason we're seeing so much more of this condition now than we did 50 years ago is not because it's a genetic disease, which it isn't. Most physicians think it is. It isn't. It's not an inherited disease. What it is a response of the brain to childhood stress. Because the brain develops under the impact of the environment, which is not something I can go into right now, but it just happens to be a fact. And if we're seeing a lot more stressed parents, we're going to see a lot of kids whose brains reflect the early stresses in their environment. And that's why I'm seeing so much more autism and everything else. Not because there's been a genetic explosion of some kind, but simply because the environment has become so stressed. That's in the beginning of life. Now in midlife, there was a study in Australia where they looked at 500 women with breast lumps. And they found that women who had been, and before they were biopsied, or before the biopsy results came back, so these women had breast biopsies. Before the results came back, whether the lump was cancerous or not, they had a psychological interview. It turned out after the results came back that if the woman had had a major stressful episode in her life in the months prior to the onset of that lump, that by itself had no effect on the lump being cancerous, zero effect. And if a woman was emotionally isolated, that also by itself had no consequence on that lump being cancerous, zero effect. So far so good. But if a woman was emotionally isolated and had a major stressful episode in her life, the chance of that lump being cancerous was 9 times as great as the average. And again, the researchers, being medical doctors, couldn't understand this. How does zero effect and zero effect add up to 9? How does 0 and 0 multiply to 9? But again, it's only because they have a very narrow medical mindset. If you understand it in scientific and human terms, you know very well when you're stressed and your cortisol levels are high, your adrenaline levels are high, and your blood pressure is high, and your nervous system is discharging in a highly triggered fashion, and if somebody comes along and says who you're connected with and who you trust and who's got some compassion, and they say to you, hey friend, hey sweetheart, hey buddy, how you doing? I can see that you're having a hard time. What happens to you? And puts a hand on your shoulder and says, let's talk about it. What happens to you physically? You relax. The cortisol levels go down. The adrenaline level will go down. Cortisol over the long time suppresses the immune system. If you're stewing in your own cortisol for a long time, that'll suppress the immune system and make that lump, permit that lump to turn cancerous. In other words, the difference was the relationship that these people had with other people. That's what made the difference. Just as with those asthmatic kids. And at the end of life, a study in the New England Journal of Medicine showed that in an elderly couple who've been together for a long time, when one of them gets sick, is hospitalized, what do you suppose happens in the other one? They have more of a chance of getting ill themselves because their immune systems are hooked into one another. That's who we are as human beings. We're deeply hooked into one another. From the beginning of life, from conception onwards to the very end. So what happens to pregnant women has a huge impact actually on the development of their children. Now, there's no time when we're as dependent on relationships and as affected affected by relationships as during childhood. Why? Because during childhood, that we're the most dependent and the most helpless. So that we need those relationships. And that's called attachment. Attachment is the connection between one human being to another. But attachment isn't there as a luxury. Attachment is a human need because of the utter helplessness and defenselessness and dependence of the human child. So attachment is a life necessity. And attachment serves the purpose of being taken care of if you're the dependent, or taken care of if you're the caregiver. So if you're attached to the people that you're looking after, you'll do a good job. If you don't care, you will not do such a good job. So attachment is essential for human life. And of course, the child has to be attached as well, otherwise he can't be taken care of. So children who detach, for example, children who are badly abused, and they detach to defend themselves, they can't be taken care of. You have to first connect with them before you can take care of them. Even my dog, Rosie, who's 12 years old, and I'm the alpha person in her life. When I wake up in the morning, until I go downstairs, she doesn't budge, she doesn't come down. But when I've been away, as I'm away on speaking trips a lot these days, and this time I won't be home for 4 weeks, I know what's going to happen. When I come home, she won't come to me, she won't run, she'll actually start shaking when she sees me. And she won't come over to me. Why? Because she's detached to defend herself against the pain of loss. And it's going to take a day or so, or me rubbing her back and taking her for walks, for her to connect with me again. So when you're detaching, you can't be taken care of. Because we have this huge need to attach. So basically, human beings are biologically wired to attach. And again, the reason we're seeing so many kids in trouble these days with these various diagnoses is because their attachment relationships have been so disturbed early in life because of stress in the parenting environment. Because human beings were never meant to be parented in the way that we're parenting kids today. What we have today is a completely unnatural aberration, a recent one. Because human beings always developed in the context of a clan, tribe, village, community, extended family. The nuclear family was never the unit of child rearing. In fact, the nuclear family didn't used to exist, not in the sense of an isolated entity. If you look at successful parenting practices, you have to look at Aboriginal peoples, such as the way that the First Nations people parented their kids before the coming of the Caucasians. They parented in community. It takes a village to raise a child. The child wasn't just connected to mom and dad. The child was connected to uncles and aunts and the tribe members and the elders, of course. Now that's all broken down in modern life. And as the African saying, it takes a village to raise a child. And when you walk down a village in Africa, even today, completely strange kids who've never laid eyes on you before will say, hello uncle, hello aunt, because they're relating to you as attachment figures, because that's how they relate to adults in general. So what we have is not our present system of the isolated family. Now what are the implications of that? We have this huge need to attach. We're biologically programmed to attach. But what happens when the attachment context changes? Now attachment is important to us all our lives. As I've given these examples show. Even as adults or old people, we still want to be loved and touched physically and to be in contact with the people that we're attaching to. So attachment is a huge dynamic in our lives. If it wasn't for attachment, we would never have to listen to country western music again. Because it's all about attachment. Who loves who doesn't love who done who wrong, who betrayed who, or opera, or Hollywood movies, or most novels. That's the central concern in human life is attachment. For the child, it's an absolutely essential quality. But there's no circuit in the child's brain that says that you have to attach to mom and dad. There's circuitry here that says you have to attach. So the drive is absolutely relentless and essential, especially when you're immature. But there's no circuitry that says, there's no instinct that says you have to attach to mom and dad. You have to listen to mom and dad, you have to respect them, you have to value their opinion. absorb their values, heed their demands. There are no such instincts. Why? Because heeding demands and absorbing values all follow attachment. When you're well attached to somebody, you will want to heed their opinion, meet their expectations, be good for them, and respect their values. So attachment is first. All this other stuff is secondary. And there's no circuit, there's no instinct that says you have to attach to mom and dad. Wouldn't it be nice if there was? Parenting would certainly be a lot easier. You'd think nature would have thought of it. And why not put a circuit in that says you have to attach to mom and dad? Well, obviously, for survival's sake. Because when you grow up, you have to detach. At least your parents are going to die. If you stay attached to them, like a child does, you can't live. Furthermore, even when you're a child, mom and dad may die or may disappear. And if you're programmed to attach only to them, you're going to die yourself. Because nobody else will then be able to take care of you. Now, in the context of the attachment village, the clan, tribe, community, neighborhood, extended family, the parents could be immature and screw up, or the parents could actually die and disappear. That would be sad, but not devastating, because that child was already connected to a whole set of adults, so that being taken care of was already facilitated. But in our society, that's not the case. So what happens when we lose our attachments? Well, what happens to you when you lose your attachments? When the person you're in love with rebuffs you, or the person you've been living with all of a sudden falls in love with somebody else. Your brain can't stand it. The human brain cannot abide what we call an attachment void, and especially not the immature human brain. The more mature you are, the more you can function independently. But when you're dependent, your brain can't handle an attachment void. So what happens instead? Well, we know what happens. Look at a duckling that hatches from the egg. The duckling looks around and sees the mother duck and imprints on the mother duck. And that means that from that moment on, he's going to follow the mother duck. Wherever she goes, he goes. So when the mother duck turns on the pond, you see the ducklings turning on a hairpin, following her. And that's pure attachment. But it's well known that if a duckling hatches with the mother duck not there, the duckling still is driven to imprint. It's purely instinctive. But what will he imprint on? He'll imprint on whatever moves. So that duckling will imprint on a mechanical moving toy, on a human being, or a dog. None of which are as well designed by nature to bring up that duckling to adulthood as the mother duck would have been. So developmentally, it's a bit of a disaster. Now, human kids are the same. They also have this programmed attachment, but dynamic, but there's nothing that says you have to attach to mom and dad. Nature assumes that the culture will take care of providing the appropriate attachments. And for most of human history, evolution, prehistory, and history, until the last 60, 70 years or so, in most situations in peacetime, the culture made sure that children had a whole set of adults to attach to. But it's like the duckling. If the attachment figures are not there for you, your brain is going to attach to whoever's around. You can't help it. Especially the immature child cannot help it. Now, what does that mean for our kids in our culture? Well, just look at them. Who is around most of the time for our kids from an early age on are not nurturing adults, but other kids. Our children spend most of their time in each other's company from an early age onwards, from preschool, kindergarten, daycare, and then of course throughout school. And that means gradually and imperceptibly, they spend most of the time in the company of other kids. And because the importance of attachment is not well appreciated in our culture, we don't make sure that wherever they go, our kids are connected to adults. So the Ontario's daycare program is going to be a complete disaster. Not because kids can't function in daycare, but because there's nothing in that program that talks about attachment, as far as I know. And that means that gradually, the child's brain, not the child, it's not a choice the child makes, it's purely instinctive. The child attaches now to whoever's around, and that happens to be the peer group. And that's what my friend and co-writer in this book, Hold On To Your Kids, which is the main subject of my talk this afternoon, Gordon Neufeld calls peer attachment. And following peer attachment is peer orientation. Orientation meaning, where do I get my sense of direction from? Who do I orient by? How to talk, how to walk, how to be, what to look like, what's important, what's not important, what's culturally relevant, what's culturally irrelevant. I get that from my attachment figures. So that's my orientation point. And what happens once I orient to my peers? That means I get all that information from my peers. Now there was a book written in 1998, published in the States, also in Canada, which nearly won the Pulitzer Prize, was elected as one of the Globe and Mail's best books of the year. It was called The Nurture Assumption. And the author wrote, basically, the nurture assumption, meaning that the assumption that parents have such an impact on kids is just an assumption. She wrote, the author, you have been led to believe that you have more of an influence on your child's personality than you really do. And she showed all the research that peers are influencing kids much more than their parents are when it comes to important aspects of their lives. And you know what? The research is accurate. But the assumption that she made is that this was somehow normal and natural. What she didn't get is that this is a recent cultural aberration. And that instead of telling people, forget it because you don't have any influence, she should have told parents, you lost influence because your kids got attached to the peer group. And this is why they got attached. But she didn't do that. She just said, this is natural, forget about it. And the press was so impressed with this that Newsweek magazine had a cover article that year entitled, Do Parents Matter? Now imagine the question. Let that sink in. Do parents matter? Now imagine a veterinarian magazine with the cover article saying, does mother cat make any difference? Does mother bear matter to the life of the infant? I mean, it's absurd. But we're so cut off from our instincts that we can actually have a leading news magazine even asking that question. And of course the answer was no, because it's the peer group that's decisive. Gordon Neufeld, who's the psychologist, and I write in this book, the question of parental influence might not be quite so crucial if things were going well with our young. That our children do not seem to listen to us, to embrace our values as their own, would perhaps be acceptable in itself if they were truly self-sufficient, self-directed, and grounded in themselves. If they had a positive sense of who they are, and if they possessed a clear sense of direction and purpose in life. We see that for so many children and young adults, those qualities are lacking. In homes, in schools, in community after community, developing young people have lost their moorings. Many lack self-control and are increasingly prone to alienation, drug use, violence, or just general aimlessness. They are less teachable and more difficult to manage than their counterparts of even a few decades ago. Many have lost their ability to adapt, to learn from negative experience, and to mature. Committed and responsible parents are frustrated. Despite our loving care, kids seem highly stressed. Parents and other elders no longer appear to be the natural mentors for the young, as always used to be the case with human beings, and is still the case with all other species living in a natural habitat. Senior generations, parents and grandparents of the baby boomer group, look at us with incomprehension. We didn't need how-to manuals on parenting in our days. We just did it, they say, with some mixture of truth and misunderstanding. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that the natural context for parenting has been eroded, and we haven't replaced it with a model that works. And then we're just responding to the consequences. So the behaviors, the acting out, instead of looking at what's being acted out, we're just trying to stop the consequences. It's like giving an asthmatic a cough medicine, because they're coughing so much, so you suppress the cough. What have you done for the inflammation in the lung? Nothing. And that's the problem with the behavioral approaches. So the parenting advice that people most often get, the timeouts and the punishments and so on, are designed to stop behaviors, and in doing so, they exacerbate the problem. They make it a lot worse. For reasons I'll explain. But let's look now what's being acted out and how it's acted out. Well, what's being acted out in the case of all troubled childhood behaviors, what's being acted out is loss of proper relationship with adults. And the quote that I used to introduce this book, and the same one I had employed in my book on attention deficit disorder, which I have myself, incidentally, as have two of my kids, and I don't think it's a genetic inherited disease, is the quote by the great spiritual teacher Krishnamurti, who said, "Action has meaning only in relationship, and without understanding relationship, action on any level will only breed conflict." Just, if you remember nothing else from the talk, remember this one. Without understanding relationship, action on any level will only breed conflict. The understanding of relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any plan of action. So let's look at our kids' behaviors in the light of relationship. So how do people attach to each other anyway? Well, there are a few basic attachment dynamics that are instinctive to us. The first way that we attach, the most basic and the most primitive and the most long-lasting one, is attaching through the senses. That means you want to physically be with the people that you're connecting to. You want to see them, hear them, touch them. And that's throughout all our lives. We want to still be held and hugged and so on. But the infant has no other way of attaching. The only way that the young infant can attach is through the senses. So when a kid is crying at night, it's because he wants to be picked up, because he needs that contact. Now, there's a man called Ferber, a doctor in Boston, who runs something called the Infant Sleep Disorders Clinic. Now, who knew that infants had sleep disorders? And they don't. What's really going on is that parents have to go to work in the morning, and it's inconvenient and a hassle when a kid keeps them up at night. And their lives are so stressed and busy already, they just want to, it's so difficult looking after kids, they just want to have a good night's sleep. The method is not called Ferberization. Here's what Ferberization consists of. And I used to advise this to my patients until I knew better. You let that baby cry for 5 minutes. Well, you make sure that they're not dirty or hungry and so on, but if you've reassured yourself about that, then you let them cry for 5 minutes, and you go in and you say, "Hi baby, here I am," and so on. Just, you're not abandoned. And then you go out for 5 minutes, and you come back 5 minutes later, and you come in every 5 minutes for the first night till he goes to sleep. The second night you extend that absence to about 7.5 minutes. The third night maybe to 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and then so on. By the fourth or fifth night, that child will be sleeping through the night, and you think you've trained him how to sleep. So the method is to ignore the child's need for contact. That's the only way he can attach. Yeah, you got him to sleep through the night. What else have you done? What have you taught the kid? Our assumptions about the world and how we perceive the world and how we perceive relationships are actually based on our earliest experiences. The child has no recollection at age 15 or age 25 that he was allowed to cry without being picked up, because the structures in the brain that you recollect with aren't developed till a year and a half. But there's another kind of memory called implicit memory, which is there at birth. In fact, it's there before birth, where the emotional template, the emotional pattern of your earliest experiences in your relationships are programmed into the brain. And that comes back later. You don't recall it, but you remember it. So the memory is in your body and it's in your emotions, but there's no recollection. That's called implicit memory. I'll be saying a lot more about that tonight when I talk about stress and health. What is the implicit memory of an infant who wasn't picked up when he cried? The implicit memory is that relationships are unreliable. The implicit memory is that the world is indifferent. The implicit memory is that there's no help. That's what we're structuring into our kids' brain when we don't pick them up. Now, so the first way that we attach then is through the senses. So let's now look at a 9-year-old, and many of you, I trust, have had the following experience. Your 9-year-old comes home from school, and you're really pleased to see her, because of course you haven't seen her since the morning. It's been 7 or 8 hours, they haven't laid eyes on her. So you greet her enthusiastically. "Hi, sweetheart. How are you?" "Okay." "How's school today?" "All right." "What did you learn?" "Not much." And then she goes to the next room and gets on the telephone or the internet, or she texts or emails, or Twitters. Who? Her friends. In other words, the same people she just spent the whole day with. And this is when you lose it. You say, what are you doing? You've spent the whole day with those people. You haven't seen me since the morning. And the first thing you do is you give me the cold shoulder and you get on the phone with them or you get on the email with them. Now look, if your spouse or partner came home at night, barely gave you monosyllabic answers, and as soon as they had a chance, they got on the phone and the email and contacted other people, and if you went to your friends to commiserate, what would they say to you? Hey sweetheart, have you tried time out? Try some tough love. They'd say, you don't have a behavior problem, you have a relationship problem. The problem with that 9-year-old is not that she's rude, it's not that she's rejecting you consciously, not that she's trying to hurt your feelings. It's simply that her attachment has been transferred to the peer group. And the attachment instinct is telling her to physically contact the people that she's attaching to. In other words, that behavior is the acting out of an attachment instinct. There's nothing conscious about it, there's nothing deliberate about it, she's driven by her instincts. Imagine yourself when you're in love, which is a heavily charged attachment state. All you can think about is when do I see him or her? How do I get in touch with them? When will they call? You're consumed by that. That's attachment in action. Well, that's what our kids are doing. They're acting out their attachments, and we've given them the technology to do it with. They all carry their cell phones. They can all Twitter now and email, and even when they're physically not in each other's company, they can be in contact with one another, thanks to the technology that we've so generously provided them with. So that's the first way that people attach, is through the senses. Now, the second way that people instinctively attach, it comes a little bit later, is by copying, by emulation, by wanting to be the same as, by identifying. So when you're attaching with somebody, you identify with them, you want to be same as them. This is when you're immature. Mature ways of attaching allow you to hold on to your independence and your sense of self. But when you're immature, you tend to want to identify with and be the same as the people that you're attaching to. So what does that lead to? Well, when kids are attached to adults, they want to be the same as adults. They want to identify with them. So they learn from them about how to be and how to respond and all that. Well, when kids become peer attached, now they're learning the same thing instinctively from immature creatures. What a disaster. Now these days, there's a lot of hand-wringing and tearing of the roots and gnashing of the teeth about kids reading. Kids have more difficulties reading now, and they don't seem to read as much, and they don't learn to read as well. And their language seems to be a bit funny. There was the American medal winner, who, when she was asked what it felt like to stand on a podium representing her country, having gained this victory, she said, "I'm like, wow." Well, that's what you get when immature creatures are teaching language to one another, and that teaching is not deliberate or conscious, it's simply what happens because it's a form of attachment. It's to be the same as. So let me read you something from the book here. This is the paperback edition. The hardcover had been published, I think, 6 years ago now. It was a bestseller, but I was quite unhappy with it. I was unhappy with it because it was a bit too heavy, a bit too long, not as well written as I wanted it to be. So I decided to rewrite it for the paperback edition and for the American edition coming out. So my daughter was 15 at the time, and she was still using my computer. She didn't have her own yet then. So I was working on my computer, working on this manuscript, and then when I left it for a while, my daughter went on the screen and got on MSN Messenger. MSN Messenger is one of these internet programs where kids talk to one another, or they can monitor each other's conversations. Like a whole group of them could be online at the same time. I still don't know how it works exactly, but that's what they do. So when I came back, I saw a conversation on the screen between two guys, two friends of my daughter's, two male adolescent friends. And the conversation was so astonishing, I had to just copy it and paste it right into the manuscript. Which I did. What you have to understand is that on MS Messenger, nobody says their real name. It's not like, hello, this is Hannah talking to George or Peter. They all have these fanciful made-up names. So the two characters in this conversation called themselves by the following monikers. The first guy called himself, then she said rectum, that's my son's name. The other guy called himself, Quantosaurus and Ripitar joined the Barnyard Tai Chi Club. Okay? Here's how the conversation goes. This is what I saw on the screen. Then she said rectum, which by the way is capitalized with 3 exclamation marks, as you'd expect from an adolescent male. Then she said rectum, that's my son's name, says, hey. Quantosaurus and Ripitar joined the Barnyard Tai Chi Club, says, sup. Now you have to understand the sup. What's up, which is what we might say, is way too sophisticated and complex. It's been shortened to sup. Then she said rectum, that's my son's name, says, 2 question marks. Quantosaurus and Ripitar joined the Barnyard Tai Chi Club, says, hey. Then she said rectum, that's my son's name, says, sup. So here's the conversation without the names. Hey, sup, question mark, hey, sup. Nothing's being said. All it is an attachment dynamic. They're just connecting is what it's all about. It's not about saying anything. I said, no wonder they don't know how to speak English. When people learn language from immature creatures, the language is going to be immature, which is why the vocabulary of an average adolescent now is almost little more than half of the vocabulary of an adolescent 60 years ago. Because they're learning from other kids. So that's what you'd expect. So that's, again, it's not a teaching problem. It's not an intelligence problem. It's an attachment problem. So the third way that people attach to one another, as we ascend the scale of sophistication of attachment, is through belonging and loyalty. So when you attach, you're going to be loyal and you're going to belong. And you expect loyalty and you'll expect belonging. So when you fall in love, what is it all about? It's all about, I belong to you. You belong to me. We belong together. I'll be true forever. Will you be true to me? More apparently, I'm your baby. You're my baby. I'm going to take care of you. It's all about belonging and loyalty. When children become peer attached, they still act out their dynamics of loyalty out of instinct, but to who? So when Rena Verk was beaten to death at the age of 14 in Victoria and drowned by a couple of her peers with several others watching, those children, all adolescents, exhibited the highest levels of loyalty you can demand of human beings because no adult even found out about it for 5 or 6 days. And everybody thought this was perverse. It wasn't perverse, pure instinct. When you're attached to somebody, you're going to be loyal to them. The problem was that the attachments, instead of being directed towards adults, were directed towards other adolescents. And that wasn't their fault. The culture did that to them. The fourth way that people attach, and if you want to see high loyalty, look at the teenage gangs. The fourth way that people attach is, as we get more mature and sophisticated, is through significance. That is to say, you want to be important in the eyes of the people that you're attaching to. Now, if you're going to be important to the adults in your life, you're going to behave one particular way. But if you're going to be important to the peers in your life, you're going to behave totally differently. The one way to be important is to be a bully. You're going to be very important when you're bullied. We think the bullying problem is a behavior problem. No, it isn't. It's an attachment problem. That's not all there is to be bullying. It's much more complex than that. But it all has to do with distorted attachments. I can't go into a talk on bullying now. But that's what we're writing the book about now. So again, these are attachment problems. What are the implications of peer orientation for parenting? Well, what does attachment do for parenting? The first thing that attachment does is it creates a hierarchy. And that hierarchy goes like, this is a natural hierarchy. You see this with animals. And certainly ought to see with human beings. And the hierarchy goes like this. I'm the one with the responsibility. I'm the one with the burden. I'm the one with the commitment. I'm the one with the experience. I'm the one with the knowledge. I'm in charge. It's like a coach in a basketball team. That's how adults ought to be. You don't have to say it. You don't have to say it. It's just there. It's just a natural hierarchy that when a person is being taken care of, there's a natural hierarchy of domination. And you dominate an infant in the sense of you're the one who decides what should happen. The infant doesn't decide. The infant can tell you what their needs are by means of crying, but you're the one who has to decide what's going to happen. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just a natural hierarchy. When kids become peer-oriented, you lose the hierarchy. In other words, you lose the authority. You still have the burden. You still have the responsibility. You still have the knowledge and the commitment. But it's so frustrating. You no longer have the authority. Because to kids it seems completely unnatural that somebody that they're not attaching to should be telling them what to do. And why aren't they attaching to you? Because the human brain can't handle competing primary attachments. Attachment is bipolar. Like a magnet is bipolar, it's got two poles. One pole of the magnet will attract, but the other will repel. So when you're attaching here, you're pushing away from there. So when kids become peer attached, you can't have primary competing attachments. You start pushing away from adults. You can have many attachments as long as the attachments are not in competition with one another. You can be attached to mom and dad and grandmother and grandfather and the uncles and the neighborhood cop, you know, if he's somebody well known to you, or the grocery man. But you can't be attached if these attachments are competing. So in a divorce, for example, when the mom and dad become competing with one another, not just in the sense of having to split, but also for the child's attention, which unfortunately happens, the child's brain is a complete quandary. Because he can't attach to both at the same time. All he can do is go with mom or dad, but not both at the same time. Or, to defend himself against that dilemma, detach from both of them. In either case, there's a significant loss. But that's because the brain can't handle competing primary attachments. So that's why it's important in a divorce, that while the parents may decide legitimately that they can't live together anymore, there ought to be no undermining of the other. There ought to be no competition for that child's love. Otherwise, you're putting the child in a completely impossible situation. So when kids become peer-attached, we lose that hierarchy, which is a natural hierarchy, which is the only thing that gives us authority to parent. You know, as Gordon and I like to say, no baby bear ever said to mother bear, "Hey, you're not the boss of me." It doesn't happen. It's natural. And it's that authority that we have that comes from the child's attaching to us that allows us to rear the child. So we think there's good kids and bad kids. No, there isn't. Sometimes parents say to me, you know, I used to have my daughter used to be so good till she was 9 years old or 10 years old or 11, and then she became bad. And the answer is, there's bad news and good news. The bad news is that the child was never good in the first place. The good news is that she's not bad now. All that's going on is that the kid was well attached to the adults, wanted to be good for them. Now she's attached to the peer group. Now she wants to be good for them and doesn't give a damn what the adults want. It's an attachment problem. It's a relationship problem, not a behavior or a moral problem. So it's attachment that makes the child want to be good for the adult. It's attachment that makes the model out of the parent. So when the kids are looking to you, they model themselves after you. It's attachment that triggers your own parenting instincts. When kids are attaching to you, like babies, they make big eyes at you, they're trying to connect with you, your heart melts and you just want to take care of them. When a kid is resisting you, it triggers all the wrong instincts in you. It triggers your anger and your disappointment and your sense of hurt, and that's where we parent from. And then the experts come along, be tough. And it kind of appeals because you want to resume control again. So you think by being tougher, you're going to resume control. But here's the problem. And then I'm going to talk to you about oppositionality now. So can I just get somebody to, would you mind standing up for a minute? I'm just going to ask you to put your hand up like that, okay? So what are you doing right now? You're pushing back, and the harder I push, the harder you push, right? Great, so I could diagnose you with oppositional defiant disorder. Because you didn't deny it, you did oppose what I was doing, right? Hence, you were oppositional. But you get what's wrong with this picture. If my foot was broken, would it be broken if I was here alone or the rest of you here present with me? Of course. If I had a viral disorder, if I had a viral illness, would I have it whether or not I was alone in the room or the rest of you here? Of course I would. But could I be oppositional if I was here by myself? Now, some of you don't seem to know what I'm talking about. Go home this afternoon, lock yourself into a room, make sure there's nobody else there, and try to oppose somebody. Okay? And if you succeed, by all means send me an email because I want to know how you did it. In other words, what I'm saying is that oppositionality, by definition, implies a relationship. So instead of diagnosing kids, why don't we look at their relationships? Now, oppositionality, such as Marzan just, am I saying that right? Marzana. Okay. That's demonstrated is a natural human response to any sense of coercion. Gordon Neufeld, my brilliant psychologist friend, calls it counterwill. Counterwill is the natural force that we generate in response to any kind of force acting upon us. To every force in nature, an equal and opposite counterforce. So counterwill is the natural resistance to coercion. There's a reason for it. There's a reason for it. Why would it be that you would automatically oppose what I'm doing? Because you can't allow yourself to be pushed around. In order to be a separate, self-respective individual, you have to be able to resist coercion. Now, this begins happening around 1.5. That's when the kids start saying that awful word, no. Everything is no. And the parents often are worried at that point because they think that somehow the cute, cuddly, compliant little baby is all of a sudden morphed into a monster. Because everything is no. Well, in fact, nature has an agenda there. And nature's agenda is that the child should grow up to be an independent person and have a will of their own. Now, how do you develop a will when the parental will is so much more powerful? And the parent himself or herself is so much more powerful? Well, you do it by opposing the parent. And so those no's, that counter-will, is nature's little way of building a small fence around the child's growing, incipient little will, behind which the child can develop his own preferences, his own meanings, his own understandings, what he likes, what he doesn't like. So first there's an automatic no, and then later on as we mature, we can say yes when we want to and no when we don't want to. But it remains with us all our lives. It's a particular dynamic that's in us all our life, as you just demonstrated, just resistance to coercion. When we push harder, just as when I pushed harder in your hand, what happens? The resistance increases. So the more we push on our kids, the more resistance we're going to get. They can't help it. They're not doing it. Nature's doing it. You didn't do it. It wasn't a conscious decision. Had you thought about it, you could have just dropped your arm. You could have. But the natural response is to resist. That's just nature, instinct in action. And in its proper context, it serves a good function to maintain our integrity, to hold on to our integrity as individuated, separate, self-motivated individuals. What mitigates counter-will is relationship. When you're connecting with somebody, you're much less likely to oppose them. Your opposition will be softened. Again, when you're in love and your partner asks you for something, you're likely to comply. In fact, you're delighted to. 5 years later, when you've been living together for a while, and you're taking the relationship for granted now, you still love them, but you're not in that acute attachment phase anymore. They ask you to do the same thing. Do it yourself. Now, with our kids, as long as they're attaching to us, they still have that oppositionality, but it's manageable. When children become peer attached, disconnected from adults, all you're left with is the oppositionality with nothing to mitigate it. And there you have the oppositional child. It's got nothing to do with anything innate to their character. It's just their relationships and how that's played out. That's what they're acting out. And by the way, this is true for rewards as well as punishments. Because when you're trying to reward kids through, when you're trying to motivate kids through rewards, what are they sensing? They're sensing that there's something you want them to do more than they want to do it themselves. If that wasn't the case, you wouldn't have to reward them, would you? And hence, the reward is a kind of emotional coercion. I know you don't want to do this, but I'm going to make it worth your while. What do we call that in every aspect of life except childhood? We call it bribery. We think we can bribe our kids into good behaviors. An American psychologist who studied motivation said, the truth is that there are no techniques that will motivate people or to make them autonomous. Motivation must come from within, not from techniques. It comes from their deciding that they're ready to take responsibility for managing themselves. In other words, motivation comes from maturation, not from any kind of coercion. And think about it in your own life. If you want to know the impact of rewards and how you'd respond. Are you ready for this? You come home from work and you're hungry and you're tired and you're sweaty and you're stressed and you're alienated. And your partner or lover or friend says to you, or your spouse says to you, hey sweetheart, I see that you're hungry and tired and sweaty and stressed and alienated, but I really feel like having sex. So I'm going to pay you $20. Okay? Now, I know that the economy of Ontario has been heavily hit by this crisis, so that I don't know what inducement that would be for many of you here, but the normal response would be, hey, heck with you, $20. This has got nothing to do with me. It's not my needs. I don't want to do this. You want to do this. Keep your money and keep your sex, for that matter. But these are the techniques that we're taught to employ with our kids. And all we're doing is we're increasing the resistance. When you look at the studies on when you reward kids to play with certain toys, as soon as you stop to pay, they stop to play. When you allow them kids to play with it spontaneously, they're likely to continue to play with it. When you're rewarding them, they'll stop as soon as the reward ends. Now, so parenting becomes really difficult once kids become peer-oriented. What about child development? Child development also stops in its tracks. Because for development, you need a certain quality called vulnerability. A tree doesn't grow where it's hard and thick. It grows where it's soft and green and vulnerable. An animal like a crab encased in a hard shell cannot grow inside that hard encasement. It has to molt, make itself vulnerable and soft in order to grow. Well, the same thing is true for human development. In the downtown east side of Vancouver, I worked with hardcore drug addicts, people that are heavily addicted to cocaine and heroin, and they have terrible lives. And I read this paragraph this morning, and I'll read it to you again. And I'm illustrating something about child development, by the way. Detective Sergeant Paul Gillespie, head of Toronto's sex crimes unit, rescued children from the purveyors of internet pornography. As the Globe and Mail reported on his retirement from police work, 6 years at that job had not inured him to the horrors he witnessed. Paul Gillespie still can't get used to the sounds of crying and pain in the graphic videos of children being raped and molested that he's seen all too often on the web. It's beyond horrible to listen to the soundtracks of these movies, said Canada's best-known child porn cop. But it is the silent images of desolate children that tear most at his heart. They're not screaming, just accepting, he said, of the infants captured in his pictures. They have dead eyes. You can tell that their spirit is broken. That's their life. Well, 2 quick points here. The first point is about drugs and drug laws. If that same policeman had been transferred to the drug squad, who'd be chasing in the streets would be those same kids 20 years later, because they're the ones who become the hardcore drug addicts. In the downtown inside of Vancouver, where I've worked for the last 12 years, North America's most concentrated area of drug use, there's nobody who wasn't traumatized in childhood. That's the first point. But the second point is about those dead eyes. Why do a kid's eyes go dead? Well, what it is, it's a form of self-protection. The brain shuts down the feeling of emotion when the emotions are too unbearable. So when children are traumatized, they shut down emotionally. That's the only thing the brain can do to protect them. The brain can't make them escape, can't make them strong enough to fight back, but the brain can shut down the emotions. Now what the problem is, that when emotions shut down, people stop developing. So the heavily drug-addicted adult, on the emotional level, functions like a 2-year-old, because that's when they've stopped developing. Then, of course, they're punished for it. But what we're seeing in North America now is a massive emotional shutdown of youth, even though most kids were not abused. What happened? What happens is, what protects you as a child is a nurturing relationship with the protective adults. So if you can go to adults who really hear you and really get what you're experiencing, then you can stay open and vulnerable, because you'll be protected and emotionally held. If you look at the suicide victims of those kids who are bullied and they kill themselves, over and over again what you find is that there's no adult they could talk to about it. They were cut off from adults. That's what made them victims, for the most part. I'm not trying to be categorical about it, but that's what we find most of the time. So when you're being hurt and you've lost your natural protection, then one way to respond to that is to shut down emotionally. And how do we see the shutdown now? We see it in the drugs our kids are using, because the stimulants like crystal meth will certainly wake you up and make you feel vital and alive when you're shut down. We see it in the extreme sports, in the way that kids have to risk themselves. It's the only way they can feel alive. Why? Because they shut down emotionally. And I haven't told you the reason why yet. But they shut down emotionally. We see it in the self-cutting behaviors. There's a tremendous epidemic of cutting now. Why do people cut? Well, there's a song by a group called the 9 Inch Nails that Johnny Cash sang on one of his last albums. It goes, "I hurt myself today to see if I could feel." When you shut down emotionally, you need to cut to see if you still feel something. And the gore and the violence in the culture. The movies that are so explicitly, and really to a normal person, I would say disgustingly, blood-riven and disturbingly violent. And that's what our kids are watching. Why? Because it takes that much to get them even a little bit excited, because they're shut down emotionally. So what's going on? What's going on is when you become peer-oriented, you lose your natural shield, which are the nurturing adults. Now the peer group is not a safe group to belong to. It's not safe not because kids are cruel by nature, but simply because they're immature. And without adult guidance, there's a lot of dissing and bullying and exclusion and bad-mouthing and so on. A lot of pain is being inflicted by kids on one another. How do you protect yourself? Well, as long as you have adult contacts, by talking about it. When you've lost that, by shutting down emotionally. Once you shut down emotionally, then you have to have all these constant stimulation, the constant noise, the constant music, the constant video, the constant scintillating light show that kids are exposing themselves to, the constant contacting one another. In other words, we're driving our kids into hyperactivity and self-harming behaviors because of the loss of contact and hence their emotional shutdown. And they stop developing because, as I say, for development you need vulnerability. So when you shut down against vulnerability, you stay immature. So now you've got generations of kids who are staying immature well into their 20s and their 30s. And if you want to see how immature they're staying, look at the TV programs that they're watching now. It's all about exploitation. It's all about relationship and who's betraying who, competition, who's going to beat who. And many of the TV programs actually exploit the most vulnerable. If you like programs like the Jerry Springer Show and so on, it's all about exploiting vulnerable people to make fun of them. That's immature culture. Why? because the culture reflects the tastes, the degraded tastes of immature youth. I'm not generalizing about our children. I'm talking about trends. Not every kid is like that, but there's grades of it. I'm talking about general trends. Now, I'll quickly finish here because I want to leave lots of time for questions. In terms of schooling and education, it totally undermines it, because for the primary quality necessary for learning is a sense of curiosity, and curiosity is vulnerable. Because when you're curious, you have to admit that you care about something. If you care about something, you can be hurt. If you shut down against vulnerability, you don't care. So you're not curious. You also have to admit that you don't know. Well, you're not going to admit that you don't know when you're defending yourself. So that the teacher's job is made infinitely more difficult. There's more to this. There's several ways of learning, but all of them are related to attachment. When you lose your attachments, for example, what do you pay attention to? You pay attention to what you're attached to. If you're attached to adults, you'll want to pay attention to what the adults think is important. If you're attached to the kids, you'll pay attention to who's dating who and who's not, who doesn't like who and who's wearing what. And if you look at the diaries of girls, as a study did in the States 50, 60 years ago, you know what the primary concern of girls was 60 years ago? You wouldn't believe this. It was, how can I make a contribution to society? That's what they wrote about. Now when you look at girls' diaries, it's, what do I look like and how well accepted am I by my peers? This has become the prime concern of many of our adolescents. The epidemic of plastic surgery, what is it all about? It's about not having a sense that you're loved and accepted for who you are, therefore you have to be loved and accepted for your looks. And all the makeover shows and the America's Top Model shows is all about exploiting this anxiety of not looking good enough, because if I don't look good enough, I'm not good enough. So the ramifications are everywhere. What to do about it? First of all, you have to get that what's gone missing. We can't restore the village. We can't go back to the tribe, the way we used to live. But we can recreate those attachment dynamics in our lives. We can recreate them by first not fomenting and fostering peer orientation. So when your kids have been in daycare the whole week, don't have sleepovers on the weekend. Don't have play dates. Why bring the enemy into your own house? That 3-year-old fiend that's going to seduce your 3-year-old son, don't do that. I don't mean that kids shouldn't play with one another. I mean that when they spend the whole week in each other's company, they need adult company. Don't take peers along on vacations. Don't think that you're socializing kids by having them play with each other. Don't think that self-esteem is built through, all the research that shows that self-esteem is based on how much your peers like you. It's such nonsense. Think about it. When your self-esteem is based on how other people like you, that's not self-esteem. Self-esteem doesn't say that I'm worthwhile because people like me. Self-esteem says I'm worthwhile. Then I can be my own person, and if people like me, that's great, and if they don't like me, that's too bad, but, I'm esteeming this person that I am. So when you build self-esteem on peer acceptance, you're building it on sand. And even the kids who get it feel insecure because they know how shifting and how insecure it is. Kids don't get socialized through playing with other kids. What's socialization? You're socialized when you have a sense of who you are and you can respect the differentness and individuality of other people. That's when you're socialized. Can you talk about a 2-year-old being socialized? That's a question of maturation. Don't think that you need to push your kids away and make them independent. Independence is nothing you have to work at. Independence is what happens spontaneously. Every creature in nature seeks to become independent. They have to. That's how they survive. So independence is nature's natural agenda. First comes the attachment relationship, which is the basis for everything, and that stays with us all our lives. And then comes your sense of a separate self, individuation, so that you can function as a separate individual, and then you can respect the separateness of others. So these are stages that follow upon one another. They happen spontaneously. All you have to do is to meet the child's attachment needs. Individuation or independence will follow, and socialization will follow. And we're far too consumed by making our kids independent. We push them away too early. And we're far too consumed in socializing them, but that's putting the cart before the horse. That's not how nature actually works. We just have to follow the natural agenda. The schools need to get into the attachment game. If our kids are going to spend most of their time in preschools and daycares and schools, we better make sure that those institutions meet the kids' attachment needs. Otherwise, we're just creating peer orientation factories. Studies in the United States have shown that kids in daycares have higher levels of stress hormone levels than those same kids at home. Except in those daycares where there's a decent adult-to-child ratio and where there's a good attachment to the adults. So the issue is not that children have to be at home. The issue is that children have to be in places where adults are attaching with them, where they don't have to then, by default, attach to the peer group instead. That's the point. And if our kids are going to spend most of our time away from us, we better make sure that where they are places of attachment, number one. And number two, when we see them at the end of the day, don't assume that they're still your kids. They're not, because they can't hold on to you. You have to collect them. And Gordon says, collect them before you direct them. Bring them under your wing. Spend some time enjoying them. Just hang out together in the morning. Spend next to 10 minutes. Get up 10 minutes earlier just to hang around and have fun with them instead of this crazy rush to get out the door. In other words, make attachment a part of your life consciously, because otherwise you're going to lose it. The family meal, which used to be not a process of simply providing food for people, but mostly a process of interacting in relationships. That ought to be safeguarded. Family vacations, only time. And when it comes to discipline, don't use methods of discipline that undermine the attachment relationship. Because if, as I've told you, the attachment relationship is the only ground for child development, then any disciplinary method that you use that undermines that is going to undermine the very goal to which you're committed, which is the healthy development of your child. So this is where I'll finish with a word about timeout. What's the essence of the timeout technique? I'm talking about the punitive timeout. I'm talking about the separation timeout. What's the essence of it? And this is advocated by experts all over the place, and they don't know what they're talking about. The essence of the timeout is, you're saying to the 4-year-old, kid, I know exactly what your biggest need is. The attachment relationship with me. Hence, I also know what your biggest fear is. The loss of that relationship. And do you know something, kid? I'm going to use that against you. So whenever you displease me, I'm going to threaten you with the loss of what you most cherish and need in this life. What is the impact? Well, the first impact is that the kid promises to be good. Why? Because you scared him to death. Naturally, you have. Oh yeah, I'll be good. And it works. They'll be compliant for the next little while. What's the long-term impact? Well, have you tried timeout on a teenager recently? Oh. You mean I don't get to be in your august presence for the next 3 minutes? How unspeakably tragic. Because by that time they shut down, they don't give a damn. They've also connected to the peer group. So don't use methods of discipline that undermine the relationship. There's a way of teaching discipline that don't undermine the relationship. So all these factors then, and I'll just finish with the final paragraph from our book, and then we'll take lots of time for questions. Who's to raise our kids? The resounding answer, the only answer compatible with nature, is that we, the parents and other adults concerned with the care of children, must be their mentors, their guides, their nurturers, and their models. We need to hold on to our children until our work is done. We need to hold on not for selfish purposes, but so they can venture forth. Not to hold them back, but so they can fulfill their developmental destinies. We need to hold on to them until they can hold on to themselves. Thank you.
C'est la belle nuit de Noël, la neige étend son manteau blanc, et les yeux levés vers le ciel, à genoux, les petits enfants, avant de fermer les paupières, font une dernière prière. Petit papa Noël, quand tu descendras du ciel, avec des jouets par milliers, n'oublie pas mon petit soulier. Le marchand de sable est passé, les enfants vont faire dodo, et tu vas pouvoir commencer avec ta hante sur le dos. Au son des cloches des églises, à distribution de surprises. Et quand tu seras sur ton dos,